there's going to be a lot of stuff, and it's going to seem intrusive. It's going to certainly feel intrusive, right? And
Welcome to My Divorce Real Estate. I'm Amber Gifford, and this is my husband, business partner, teammate, Scotty Gifford.
And today we have back with us Mike Day, a board certified family law attorney here in the Houston local area. And Mike, today we're going to be talking about how to be a good client.
Well, that's kind of important, right? Because I'm sure clients are like all over the spectrum.
Yes, they can be for certain.
And undeniably, because they're stressed and scared and
Oh.
everything else. So we're not judging you guys. We're just going to go over what you can do to better your relationship with your attorney when you find one.
So I would say that the first thing is to be honest, right? So you have to tell your attorney the good things, the bad things, and everything in between. So they need to know that in order to view your case appropriately, analyze it, see what the problems are, because there are some things that could be problems that, it'll take a little while before you go to mediation or you go to court. And so it gives the lawyer the opportunity to help you address those weaknesses in the case, right?
Sure.
And so that's important, is to be honest. The other thing to know is that people will sometimes want to know, well, do I have a good case? And in family law, if you have a good case, then that probably means something is going really wrong in your life. And
so the good is the
I was
bad,
about to
right?
say, what is it? What does that mean? But that's
exactly
probably true, right?
Exactly. It's just one of those things where it's not taken in a vacuum. You kind of have to look at it from a comprehensive perspective. Mm-hmm. So if someone comes in, it's like, well, the other parent is loving and attentive. So I don't want that parent to spend any time with the kid, though. It's like, well, that's a really hard argument. You're probably not going to get very far with that unless you have a really, really, really good reason. And if you don't have any good reasons, well, good news, bad news. Good news is your life's going pretty well. Bad news is you don't have a good case, and that's just something to be mindful of. The other thing is that if you are honest with the client, or if the client's honest with you, then there ought to be the groundwork laid for realistic expectations, because, look, all judges are different. And so especially if it's in the beginning stages where you don't even know what court you're going to be in, just know that the range of expectations will narrow as the case goes on once you know what court you're in. And then sometimes you have a new judge, or sometimes you're not sure how the judge is going to view these facts in the case. And so sometimes you're gonna have to wait and see. You're either gonna have to see how the judge rules at a hearing, or maybe you can get some feedback elsewhere, like maybe through the mediation process. But just know, as the client, that it's not like you're going to go on some website and know exactly how this judge views things, because that's not how it really works. The other thing I'd say is that the legal system is seldom as it appears on television.
You're not going to wrap up the case in like 30 minutes, bring up some file.
Yeah, there's a montage of putting together all the exhibits, and then boom, we're ready for the dramatic closing statement. No, that's not how it works. There's
you're going to wave your finger at the other side, and they're going to go, "You're right. I was right." It was.
So years ago, when I was in law school, I read this book called The Conquest of Happiness by a very famous philosopher named Bertrand Russell. And he had some really awful advice. He had some really awful advice. I mean, he wrote this book, I guess it was in the 1920s. It was before people really knew what a bad person Stalin was. And he's like, what a youth, an ambitious young person should do? They should go work on an agricultural commune in Stalinist Russia. That will be a very life-affirming experience. I mean, I don't think you could give much worse advice than that. However, He had one good piece of advice, and that is, don't expect life to be constantly exciting. there are going to be large periods of life where it's going to be kind of boring, and that's okay. Well, that is very true of the legal system. There's going to be a lot of time spent doing boring stuff. It's very, very rare for anybody to enjoy doing discovery, right? And if you're a client or a prospective client, and you maybe organization isn't your strong suit, right? Know that that's even going to be, the discovery process is even going to be harder, right? And yeah, your lawyer is going to want those monthly bank account statements, and they're going to want those text messages, and they're going to, there's going to be a lot of stuff, and it's going to seem intrusive. It's going to certainly feel intrusive, right? And
it takes time to gather.
It takes time. It's labor intensive. It's unpleasant. It's boring, right?
There's not a lot of action. Yeah.
Not a lot of, right? Like in the movies, it's just a montage sequence. But in real life, it's like, oh God, I got to do this.
I mean, there's a waiting period here of 60 days anyway. People don't even know that half the time, right? I mean,
there is a waiting period, but it's pretty rare for a case to get wrapped up in 60 days.
I only know like one. Cases of our clients that had it done in 60 days, and it was no kids, simple, right? Okay, maybe 2.
Right. Simple. Yeah. I mean, so a lot of things you won't figure it out within 60 days, right? And that's especially true if one of the spouses is self-employed.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, each case is different, but in terms of being a good client, you just want to know that a lot of this it's not how it is on TV, and there's a lot of boring sort of grunt work that goes into it.
Yeah, I think we always try to express that to our clients too, that there's 2 things that are take long when you're contacting us. There's 2 things that take longer. It's going to take longer to deal with the house stuff than you think, and it's going to take longer to settle your case than you think. And just put that expectation out there that it is going to be way slower than you think, right? As far as handling this divorce, because you didn't just get married last week. You guys didn't just get a hotel room. Like, you've built a whole life together, and now you're going to try to unpack all that stuff, right? And all that baggage and all the possessions and all the things.
Well, and the counties too, they're getting a hearing date. Like,
there's things that are out of control again, right? Like those things that you can't control, that the court systems, to get a case filed might be, so many days out.
So I want to clarify something, because not me personally, but I do know there's people out there going, how honest do I have to be? I've been cheating on my spouse. Do I need to tell you that information? I mean, I know the answer to this, but I think you should tell them how important it is for them to be upfront.
Yeah, because it helps you, right? So it helps you because, the last thing you want is, like, let's say a particular spouse has been spending money in a way that they shouldn't, right? Which in divorce world, that typically means gambling or strip clubs, right? Well, you don't want that to come up for the first time in discovery if you can avoid it, right? Because what that will do is there's going to be some betrayal trauma there no matter what, but it'll make it worse, right? And so if there are bad disclosure of bad things, then if you have a lawyer who knows what's going on, there's the opportunity to be a little bit more intentional about how those bad facts are shared with the other person, right? Because you can say, well, I did this and I did that, and I know the legal system frowns upon it. I went to a strip club, but that's because, we hadn't been intimate in a while. I'm just taking an example. It's like, well, you know what? That's still going to be really hard for the wife to hear that. And we can just sandbag her with that disclosure, or we can actually be intentional and have a conversation with the lawyer on the other side and see if there's a way to handle that in a more productive way. Because if the other person loses, you're already going through a divorce. So there's a good chance that there's diminished trust there and diminished goodwill, and that other person's not necessarily going to be imputing the best of intentions to you, right? And that's the thing about being a client through this process is like, yeah, you've probably been traumatized on some level. But the other person is going through their stuff too. And so sometimes you'll have a case and the legal issues themselves are not necessarily so difficult, but the processing of those legal issues can be,
True.
right?
Honesty.
And so sometimes you just need time. People need time, because the last thing that you want to do is rush through the process and let somebody make a bad decision, whether that's a decision that's informed by a sense of vindictiveness or informed by, what have you. I mean, really, someone once said to me, well, I don't think family law is very complicated. And
Really?
That's what they said. And what
Wow.
I didn't respond, but what I should have responded to, well, family law is as complicated as the human condition can get.
True.
Right? Because what we're really addressing is the human condition. And yeah, maybe the nuts and bolts of the legal issues aren't so complicated, but if you have someone who has invested certain emotional associations, for lack of a better term, with whatever particular issue, right? Like, let's say the spouse that's had the issues with spending felt that the other spouse was being controlling, right? And I kind of view this as, not akin to like what children do as they become adults and they try to differentiate themselves from their parents. Well, the spouse will differentiate themselves from, their prior married self, right? And I have clients, and it's like they're freshmen in college all over again. They're maxing out the credit card, going out all the time,
Crazy. Yeah, you kind
yeah.
of use it. They do.
And it's like, okay, when you were 18, that was one thing. You're not 18 anymore. Let's pump the
probably
brakes.
40 or 50 right now, right?
Yeah, right. Let's figure out what's going on here.
Yeah, that's not being a good client. You shouldn't be spending money.
Well, but the other side too is, people will sometimes be unnecessarily nasty, right, about it. And it's like, and that goes back to the technical competence thing, right? Because a lot of times people will just put in there, well, we want to spend on reasonable and necessary living expenses. And that's good for a lot of folks, right? Maybe even a majority. But some cases I'd say, well, why not just do ordinary and customary, right? Because maybe you are used to spending money on things that are not necessaries. But,
True.
If everybody's in agreement, right? Why unnecessarily consent to a limitation that you don't necessarily want or need?
True. So I know you touched on organization and some people that just aren't organized. And I mean, to me, like knowing what I know now, obviously being a good client would be to coming to the meeting, once I've retained an attorney, being prepared, having, if you can get them, copies of bank statements and all your assets and all of those things. It just makes it so much easier. Ideally we want every client to come in that way, right? Like, oh, what is your house? How much is it? And how much you owe? Like, it doesn't always really go that way. And if you're not partaking in the bill paying, like I wasn't, like, you're kind of left and blindsided. Like, you don't really know. So I was left to actually go through all our stuff in a safe and start snapping pictures of everything so I could educate myself, because I was like, I don't have any idea. Not that I thought he was going to hide it, but I just really didn't know my own self, and I take responsibility for that now. But organization, so being organized would be qualifications for a good client, I would assume.
And this is especially, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Scotty. Please go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so we've covered honesty, organization. We're going to say,
you're saying trust.
We need to be able to trust our attorney, right? And trust that, what we're going to be doing is honest. But like, so communication wise, how is it? Like, are you going to say we always going to communicate? Like, I think we talked in the previous video, we talked about, hey, we do verbal communication. You try to follow up with an email and say, hey, this is what we talked about, just so we're clear, right? So like, that sounds like a really good form of communication that you have with your clients there. Is that standard practice? Is that something that, what other forms of communication? Like, should I be expecting a text message from you at 9 o'clock at night? I assume not, but.
Right. Sometimes I'll get text messages at 9 o'clock. Look, if things are, sometimes you have a bona fide emergency and I've and I typically give my cell phone number to clients, which a lot of lawyers don't do. But I mean, I've had situations where I've needed to field that phone call, right?
Sure.
And so that happens. What I would say though is, so communication's important, but also, in terms of expectations of the process, expect for that differentiation to occur and expect for it to challenge you. And what I've found to be the case, in particular, is in relationships where you had firmly defined divisions of labor. So you had one spouse, typically the wife, but not always, who was primarily responsible for caregiving of the children, right? And they're just kind of, for years, they just kind of had carte blanche over extracurricular activities and making sure the kids got to softball on time or whatever the case may be, right? And then on the flip side is you had one spouse who was primarily the breadwinner, right? And then they would be busy with work, they would be traveling a lot, there's a lot of delegation of domestic responsibilities. Well, then you start the divorce process, and the breadwinner finds it uncomfortable that the other spouse has all these questions about the finances, right? And they want to know all this information, and it's very off-putting. They kind of feel like their sphere is almost being invaded. They kind of feel insulted, like, of course I'm going to do a good job with this, right? Now, they may not have that other spouse's best interests at heart, but in their vantage point, they're going to view that as insulting. And then the flip side is that if you had the spouse who was primarily responsible for the kids, and now all of a sudden, it's very standard to have standard possession, expanded standard possession order, so that spouse that was working all the time, well, now they're court entitled to about 42% of the time, and they're going to want that time. And it's like, well, why? You haven't wanted it in the past. And that's the thing about the divorce process, is that things change, right? And so,
People have a hard time with this.
Yeah, I think that's really we hear that a lot too. So from your perspective, I know you hear a lot, but we hear it too from clients, like, well, he wasn't ever involved with the kids before. Now all of a sudden he wants all this time with them. And it's, I think sometimes when we start realizing what we're going to lose, we start grabbing onto things, and we want to hang on to those things. We want to make sure, because that was one of my big fears of a divorce as a man, was that I wasn't going to get to spend the time with my boys anymore. And I was very involved father at the time. So like, I wasn't like, I was like, hey, I was always off traveling. I was involved, and I was one doing the dentist appointments and doctor's appointments, but I was still fearful that I was going to lose, that time with them. So that was a real fear of mine.
I was like, take them. Fine, I just take a break.
I love it, because this will happen from time to time. I'll be representing the client who primarily takes care of the kids, and like, oh yeah, let him have his court appointed time. He's gonna start giving that time back here soon enough, right?
Yeah.
Or what I like is when the other parent just kind of uses that time, and it's like, well, your kid's a teenager, your kid's 17, right? They're driving themselves to places. Why you got to be a jerk about things, because that's the one thing I always tell people is, put your kids first and work backwards from there. And sometimes you'll have intellectually honest disagreements about what's really best for your kids, right?
For sure.
But sometimes those disagreements are just, they're really not about the kids. They're about something completely different. Right.
Agreed.
And so that one of the things I also feel that people who are going to be going through this process is realize that you're going to need space to grieve. And it's just like any other loss. And that takes time as well. And so even if the legal issues are not super complicated, cutting edge type stuff, that doesn't make it any less important. And that doesn't make it any easier for you as the party to process. And, sometimes lawyers are like, well, this person just needs to get over it. And it's like, well, it's not always that easy. And
it's hard. And when I think too, the best advice I got from my therapist at the time was, Amber, you don't know what's going on in the house over there. So when the kids call you to complain and tell you daddy's doing this or whatever, for you to jump in or jump him about the situation, you really don't know. I mean, they could have mouthed off. Like, I really don't know. So I really took that to heart and made an effort to, like, hey, he loves you. You go talk to daddy about it. I'm not there. I don't know. I do think it's super important, but it's really hard to rein it back in when you have been the primary person handling the emotional capacity of all of this all the time. And it was a hard lesson for me to learn. And Scotty actually taught me to just, you don't need to say anything back. Like, let me say something back, always. And he's like, why? Like, why are you saying something back? Why? It's advocating. No, that's not advocating. You're creating strife, and there's just no point. Like, they're safe, they're happy, they're loved. It's really what matters at the end of the day. Just because that parent doesn't do it like you do it, well, so what? I mean, it is hard to process and to get over it. It took probably years, but at the same time, it is in the best interest of the child to push them that direction. That's your dad. You're with your dad, or you're with your mom, that kind of thing. We're probably getting off topic, but whatever.
No, I think it's good to get some into those idiosyncrasies of what the cases and personal stories. And I think, one of the things that we hear sometimes, and as or somebody comes to us and they are making plans, but the spouse doesn't know anything about it yet. So they might be, and we've heard this from Christy Mendelow, who's one of our colleagues, is a certified divorce coach. She talks about, people contemplate divorce for almost a year before they pull the trigger, right? So that one spouse might have been processing this for a whole year.
So far ahead emotionally than you are.
And then jumping on the other spouse, whether it's the male or the female, they jump on the other spouse and they're just like, oh my goodness. And they need that time to process, like you said, and they just don't, they have to go through all those stages, right, of grief and loss and acceptance.
And they do.
So it's like important to have that attorney that can be able to realize where they're at emotionally and how you need to communicate to them, during those different phases, and realize that they're going to go through those phases. That's really important. I thought.
Where were you in 2015, Mike? I needed you. No, I do want to add this too, because it was something that you said triggered this thought for me about being a good client. And we're not immune to going back to mediation and enforcements and things like that either. Scotty and I both were married before, and Scotty is not a complainer. He is not a let me say something back to you. Like, I just have no need to create conflict, but I have noticed in the course of going through attorneys that it is important, yes, to be honest, but like even more so, like when something would transpire that was negative, he wouldn't say anything to his attorney because he didn't complain, like, whatever, you're just going to be a psycho, do it. But in turn, in retrospect, when we just talked about this a few weeks ago or more, that, hey, I think you should go ahead and tip off your attorney to let them know this transpired. So in case that opposing counsel does come at your attorney, it doesn't look bad on you. Like, hey, why are you doing this? They assume you're doing whatever might be suggested because you've not said anything to your attorney, because you're not a complainer, or you're like, whatever, let them be crazy. I just don't play that game, which I think is very smart. But I said in our best interest and everybody else's, just shoot a quick email. Hey, just want to let you know what transpired. I don't need to comment back. Wanted you to know.
Yeah, I think that's a really, that's really a good way to approach that. There's a joke at the office, no news is either good news or I just haven't heard the bad news yet. So
I like that one.
I'm glad I brought that up, because it just kind of dawned on me a while ago. Like, I know you never, be combative, but like, it's important for you as an attorney and everyone's attorney to know, like, you're right. If you don't say anything, you kind of wonder, like, what the heck's going on? This person hasn't said anything to me about this.
So that's from a client, from an attorney's perspective. Like, if you don't need to hear every little complaint and every little little thing, but you do need to hear the big things that might be applicable to the case,
right? And you won't really know. Look, I mean, err on the side of disclosure. Just realize that the more you say, there's a tendency to want to get emotional validation from your lawyer, and that's very natural. But just know that the more frequent the communication is, it's, if you're not constantly getting it, don't think it's because they don't care, but, just just be mindful of that. And then the other thing too, I'll say is, and this goes back, I'm not talking about any one person in particular or a particular situation, but sometimes you'll have this underlying dysfunction. And I see it a lot when you have, hopefully I'm going to put myself out there and just kind of say this, but you'll have a situation where the wife is maybe got some undiagnosed or potentially diagnosed mental health issues, right? Where she is borderline.
Right.
And there is a natural tendency, maybe not natural. I've just noticed a pattern sometimes of you get these guys who are very agreeable and they kind of gravitate towards these women. And they're just sort of domineering in the family law process. And you see one of two things. You either see where the guy just puts up with it and kind of lays down, or eventually they say, I've had enough. And there's typically something that's really happened that's just really objectionable. And those are the sorts of cases that go to trial, right?
Wow.
And that's just, I don't know, something I've noticed. And so, if you're a client, you might get feedback that you don't necessarily want to hear, right?
I appreciate
and
that.
that's a hard thing to say, right? That's either side of that conversation is really, really difficult, right? But and I'll have clients who are getting a divorce from someone who's a narcissist, right? Because that's becoming a more common, phenomenon.
Right.
And, it's certain decisions are above my pay grade, maybe, or maybe I'm not the person to give you certain tools, right? I can only kind of give you the what it looks like on the legal side, but just know as the client, this is kind of it can be a very challenging process. And so not all the feedback you're going to get is welcome.
I agree with you. I mean, that's why we always say you need a team, you need a counselor or a coach, or you need other people, because your job is to get the divorce done. Our job is to help them with their assets and what their options are. And yes, we see a lot of bleed through, a lot, and I'm okay with it. And at some point I have to cut it off and be like, okay, well, let's redirect, just probably like you as well. And the ones who don't agree is when you hit the truth and it hurts. And I understand it's hard. It's really, really hard. And your job is difficult as well. But I mean, I think at the end of the day, like everyone who is seeking out an attorney and they have hired one, you need to remember that, you're not their only client. They're working with multiple people, and that they're working in your best interest. Do you have to agree with it? No, you don't walk in their shoes. So they need to have an advocate like themselves, like, hey, I don't like this idea. What are my other options? But at the end of the day, that's your job, is to get the divorce. Just like our job is to give them their options for their house and facilitate it. So it's being open-minded on some level, which is really hard. I understand when emotions are.
Yeah, and I think that plays really well. I'm sorry, Mike. You want to say something?
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that plays really well into the respecting of the attorney, right? Because you're coming to them to seek their expertise and to seek their advice, and you're going to be paying them. So you want to listen to them, right? Because they probably dealt with more divorces than just yours, right? So it's like they at least have some expertise. Like Amber said, they don't know every aspect of your life. They only know what you told them and what you've discovered. But like, they know the how the legal system is going to play out, and they know what the pitfalls to look out for. So you should actually listen to your lawyer, even if you don't like what you might not be hearing right away. Take that time to process that, right?
Yeah, you may not like being told you want to get a divorce from your spouse. I mean,
right.
You may not like that.
And the other thing too about being a client is take your time finding a lawyer, because here's the thing: it's not. From the lawyer's perspective, it's not at all problematic for someone to consult with, 2 to 4 lawyers, right? To kind of find who's going to be the right fit and for the case and the objectives of the case and what have you. But once you start switching lawyers, it's like, okay, someone switched to lawyer a second time. All right. But there's a cliche amongst lawyers about you really want to be careful about being the third lawyer on a case. And as the case progresses, as that number gets higher, the lawyer gets
Red flag.
increasingly more reluctant.
So
Wow.
looking at the sixth attorney on the case, right? You're probably,
That goes
probably
back
that's attorneys, right?
That goes back to that whole finger pointing thing. There's three back here. You gotta tell, you might want to look behind you.
Yeah.
Say it all the time. Well,
Yeah.
we really appreciate your time. Everybody, let's be a good client, pick a good attorney, watch our other video for that. Anything you want to add real quick?
Yeah, we're
before
gonna
we end?
do a couple more videos. We'll stick around for the next. We'll walk through a client intake with Mike Day here, and we'll link to his information below if you want to get in contact with him. And so we just appreciate your time being with us, Mike, and we'll see you soon in the next one.
Yep.
Yep.
Thanks so much, everybody. And as always, we're here to bring you real life experiences to all your real estate needs. Now I have to do it.
She always does something.